Thank you all for joining us. We will get started momentarily. We're just letting folks get logged in. Again, if you do have any initial questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A box and our panelists can address those. Thank you all for joining us today. We will now get started and I'll turn it over to ASH Executive Director Laurent Hubert.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I want to thank and welcome everyone for joining us today for this webinar, which is hosted by ASH, Action on Smoking and Health in DC, Surfrider Europe, the ITC project, International Tobacco Control Project, and Fair Resource Foundation on how to best create synergies between the WHO FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and the UN Treaty to End Plastic Pollution. And this is in order to progress towards a ban on cigarette filters in order to protect health and the environment. We have we were scheduled to have 5 panelists, but 4 are live. One, unfortunately, is ill and will not be able to join us today, but sent a few comments I will address later. But those panelists will share their views around the outcomes of the last round of negotiations of the UN Treaty to develop a treaty to address plastic pollution, and the implications of this last round of negotiations on cigarette filter bans, and how to best synergize with the upcoming round of negotiations of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is the 11th conference of the parties of the treaty, in order to accelerate progress towards filter bans. Today, we'll have a panel discussion, so feel free to ask questions to any of the panelists using the Q&A function, and feel free to direct them to a specific panelist if you wish, and then I will be able to address them as the moderator. So again, feel free to use the Q&A function, which for me at least is at the bottom of the screen under the says Q&A for me. So please use that function to address or ask some questions to the panelists. Just very quickly, I know we have a diverse audience, so we have some people who are very familiar with both the plastic treaty and the tobacco treaty. But just to give a very less than a minute description of what we're talking about. On one side, we're very fortunate in global health and in tobacco control that we have a UN treaty to address this issue. Is the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a treaty that's ratified by most of the world, 183 parties, covering more than 90% of the world population. And the 11th round of negotiations since the adoption of the treaty, COP11, will take place this November in Geneva, starting on November 17th. And then simultaneously, there's been also negotiations on a treaty to end plastic pollution. There have been 6 rounds of negotiations. The treaty was supposed to be done in 5 rounds of negotiation. They were unable to finish, so a 6th round was scheduled that took place last August in Geneva, and several of us who were, those of us, myself and those on the panel attended those negotiations. But unfortunately, it did not conclude with a treaty. And you'll hear more about that as you hear from the panelists. I'm going to introduce the panelists quickly one by one. We're very fortunate, very happy to have Lisa Pastor with Surfrider Europe, and she's an advocacy officer for Surfrider Foundation in Europe, which is a grassroots NGO with about 13,000 members across 12 European countries that works on marine litter, water quality, coastal management, and climate change. And they try to influence legislation in France, regional European legislation, as well as the UN legislation, global governance processes like the plastic treaty. They've been very engaged in a Surfrider campaign against cigarette butts, calling for a ban on cigarette filters. We're very fortunate to have them on board today. We have Jeff Fong, Dr. Jeff Fong with the University of Waterloo, Canada, who's the principal investigator for the ITC project that has been tracking the impact of tobacco control policies around the world before they implemented and after they implemented. So critical world for our work. Then we have Paula Jones with ACT Brazil. She's the co-founder of ACT and director of ACT Brazil, ACT Health Promotion, a Brazilian-based coalition that's been working on the topic of commercial corporate determinants of health and environmental issues. And Paula brings over 2 decades of experience working on those issues at national, regional, and international level. And finally, we also have Elizabeth Ferguson, Liz, with ASH, and she's the Chief Operation Officer at ASH, and she's been engaging in the plastic treaty negotiations from the beginning. So thank you all for joining us today for this panel. And again, I'm reminding to all of the attendees that you feel free to use the Q&A function to ask any question to any of the panelists. So I'm going to start with a question, and I'm going to invite each of the panelists in turn to provide a brief answer to that first question. But what were your key goals and expectations when you started engaging in the plastic treaty negotiations as an organization? And particularly, what were your tobacco-centering goals? And has the process lived up to your expectations so far? And has progress made towards the goals that your organization had? We'll start with Lisa, and then Paula, Liz, and Jeff. Lisa, why don't you go first?
Yes, hello. Thank you for the invitation and this question. So, of course, Surfrider Europe is part of a global network with like Surfrider US, Surfrider Canada, and Surfrider Australia. So each Surfrider was following a different session of the plastics treaty. So for Europe, we followed the ones that took place in our region. So of course, I think we had a broader scope, I think broader expectations because we mostly work on the fight against plastic pollution. So a lot of expectations for this round of negotiations. But I really feel that um, a main point was to have more visibility on these issues we are working on, and especially on cigarette filters, to also use this as a platform, of course, to have an international legislation, and that would have been our ultimate objective there, but also to get time to just inform decision makers about the impacts of cigarette filters on the environment, of course, everything related to their ineffectiveness regarding health. But I feel that we kind of succeeded in this at our scales, but with decision makers from France and from the EU, and also to engage all our communities, so all volunteers throughout the world and also in Europe to get to know more about these impacts and to also call on decision makers to adopt a ban. So, of course, this is quite deceptive. However, as international, like environmental NGOs, we recalled everyone that no treaty is better than a weak one that could not evolve with time. But yeah, I think informing the public and decision makers were also part of our work there, and we had a little acceleration, I think, on this way.
Thank you, Lisa. So you just want to point out the point you made that you were of the view also that at the end of this last round of negotiations, better to have no treaty than a weak treaty. And then a quick question, follow-up question for you. You said one of the key objectives and goals was to inform decision makers in the region. And do you understand correctly that you feel that you somehow succeeded with that? Did you manage to get the attention of decision makers, particularly on the topic of cigarette filters? Was that something that was successfully done and across ministries?
I think yes, even though on one side, I think we did not hear a lot about this in contact groups or in um, uh, like panel sessions there from decision makers, heads of delegations. But I could talk more about that. We launched an emailing campaign on a Chile platform. This is an application, a platform to send emails to heads of delegations that we created, and we had some great feedback because many heads of delegations from European countries received actually hundreds of emails from our volunteers, just putting facts about cigarette filters and also highlighting the possibility we had to integrate them in the scope of the treaty because some of them did not even know that there was this mention in the project of text we had.
This is a very good point, and one that I wonder maybe we can follow up in talking about synergies, given that we have our treaty, the tobacco treaty also. That might be also an opportunity for collaboration and for reaching out to the network and using this platform, which Can you remind me the name of that platform?
It's Chile. I
Chile.
could try to
Correct.
write
Yeah,
it.
Chile. That would to use that also maybe to reach out to the negotiators that will attend the COP, and especially because we're a bit concerned about sometimes a bit of lack of communication between environmental ministries and health ministries. So thank you for that, Lisa. Paula, it was the same question. I don't know if you want me to repeat it, but what were your expectations going in as an organization? Has it lived up to your expectations and your goals on tobacco control, and particularly the cigarette filter ban?
Well, I think in the beginning, just the discussions around a plastic pollution treaty, I think it was a perfect connection between health and environmental issues. I mean, I think that was one of the major motivations to follow it. And cigarette filters are a very visible and obvious part that connects and also that was a legally binding treaty. And because we had the FCTC and then the very process of negotiating a treaty for plastic pollution, I think my first, perhaps a bit, I might say it now, a bit naive expectation that we would have a process similar that we had for the FCTC. And it didn't happen that direction, right? And I think part of that so far, but I think there are lots of opportunities. But the major one, as I mentioned, was the things of like the obvious connection between health and environment, not only the aspect of tobacco control, but also our other risk factor for non-communicable diseases. I think they are pretty much directly linked with that, and the magnitude of plastic pollution, like being a global emergency and bringing people together to find solutions for that emergency. Another thing that was my expectation was to have like really solid discussions about conflict of interest, because this is something that happened in the FCTC negotiations as part of the negotiation process. And that's, I think that's for me, in a way, it's the most challenging part of the plastic treaty negotiations, because the plastic industry, the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, they are all over the place. So it's like, oh, how are we going to get a strong treaty having them in the room? And that's, I think, the story that perhaps tobacco control has to teach also to these other forums. I think I'll keep it for now to leave it for the debate.
Great points. I think it's a very important point for those of us who were throughout the whole FCTC process and engaging in the INC negotiations. Very different process. The appetite for multilateralism seems to not be there. The willingness to find consensus not there, and the issue of corporate capture, corporate influence, commercial interest impacting the process has definitely been a major obstacle to the plastic treaty negotiations. Liz, what were your expectations also? I mean, you were the one who alerted the ASH team about this when UNEA adopted a resolution to start the treaty negotiations. You're the one who brought us up to speed and encouraged us to engage in that process. So what were your expectations from the very get-go?
Sure. So thank you, Laurent, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone joining us today. In terms of our expectations, I'll tie that back to our goals, and they are, very much in line with our other panelists. ASH was really very interested in obviously banning or phasing out cigarette filters, which we all know now, most littered item on Earth, with 4.5 trillion of them discarded annually. We're really, a bit ambitious, possibly a little naive in thinking that maybe we could get this done within this process, just like Paula was saying. Our other second goal, really to safeguard the FCTC and ensuring that the final text doesn't conflict with the FCTC or undermine it in any way. And then, of course, as Paula also mentioned, securing strong conflict of interest provisions to ensure that firewalls are in place to guarantee that corporate conflicts of interest don't undermine the final outcomes of this treaty, but also create any further challenges with the FCTC. I know we'll get into that a little bit more today. But to answer the other part of your question, has the process lived up to our expectations? And I'd have to say not yet. We don't have a final text, and the progress has been a bit bumpy, perhaps even a little uneven. So, for example, we had cigarette filters appear in Annex X. of an earlier draft. And at one point, the FCTC was actually named in the treaty text, and both were removed in subsequent drafts. But even though this has happened, number one, the process isn't complete yet. So we shouldn't see this as a failure. But also, this entire process has really created an opportunity for education and awareness raising within our own tobacco control community, but also more importantly, across the environmental movement. We've had the opportunity to connect with other IGO networks, and then government and member states themselves on this topic. For example, the plastic filters just being included in the previous version of Annex X, there was a big debate and discussion within our own community over the exact wording. So for example, the actual text listed plastic filters versus just cigarette filters. So again, this created an opportunity for education and awareness raising in our own tobacco control and health communities, but again, broadly within the environmental communities and the movement itself. So again, while the treaty hasn't fully captured our goals, the process has undeniably advanced them. And so we have continued opportunities to connect, work together, and align in the months and hopefully years ahead. So I'll stop there and thank you, Laurent.
Thank you, Liz. As you point out, it's not done yet. So there's still hope at the end of the tunnel. And as you point out, that we did manage to really educate the community about filters in general beyond the health community, which I think was definitely a bit of a victory, so to speak, for both for health and environmental health. Jeff, you've attended also you've a number of treaty FCTC negotiations, the plastic treaty negotiations, and as someone who's been also monitoring the implementation of policies around the world, what were your expectations, and did the process live up to it, and what was the good and the bad so far?
Well, I like the others, had hope that there would be a widespread recognition that would end up in actual mention of the need to ban filters. I also recognize that it was a global plastics treaty, and so that trying to ban all filters would be a real challenge because they were having problems even articulating what kinds of plastics would be potentially banned. So, it felt like something that we could push, but not expect anything to happen. So I attended the last three sessions of the negotiations in Ottawa, Busan, and now Geneva. And I was really struck by the fact that filters sort of weaved in and out of the discussion. But overall, there was a general sense of recognition among a very broad spectrum of the delegates and the observers that this is something, filter ban is something that is needed, and there was a greater understanding of the reasons why, and a greater articulation of both the health and the environmental impact of filters, sufficient to keep it very visible. Of course, filters are extraordinarily visible and so numerous, ubiquitous, that it's kind of an easy sell with respect to, the signal aspect of them being a serious source of the most ubiquitous source of single-use plastics. I, as a researcher, was also interested in the barriers to the delegates and the observers alike in why there might be resistance to this, not just because of the business concerns that were all throughout all the negotiations, but also just the intuitive beliefs about filters. And here we have known for a long time that filters are deceptive. They're called filters. They're supposed to filter. I mean, coming off of COVID, we have HEPA filters, we have other sorts of filters, we use Brita filters sometimes in our water and so on. Filters, like why would you want to ban something that is actually a health, a positive thing for health? Well, you have to dissuade people from that and actually turn it 180. It's hard enough, we know in communications to get your point across when the intuitions line up with your negotiating or your advocacy position. Here you have to turn it 180. So it's an additional challenge. And what I did in Busan was ITC had done some work showing that there was a widespread among those who smoke across 4 countries, representative national samples in 4 countries, that there was widespread misperceptions that filters actually do something to reduce the harms of cigarettes. Well, I did a survey in Busan showing that those attending, and there was a mixture of delegates and observers there, sort of, randomly or haphazard sampled, it was the same level of misperception among those attendees. So people are people with this intuition about filters that's wrong. And I think that that is an important point to be made about how we, as a tobacco control community or environmental community, have to address the issue of filters. We have to get right at the heart of that misperception and turn it on its head. So, with respect to the future, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. I'm hopeful that there's going to be something about filters, but we are, as researchers, are going to continue down the road of illuminating and possibly having some kinds of ways of reducing the misperceptions among the public and especially among the delegates at the next negotiating session.
Thanks for that. So you raise a good point about the challenge of communicating the reality about filters that they do not protect health, which is what people believe. And obviously it makes sense if you're not if you don't work into the area of tobacco control and addressing the environmental or health impacts of tobacco products, it's not something that would be intuitive for most people. And I think the tobacco industry has probably done a very good job also at framing the filters that are a necessary element of the cigarette to somehow protect the people who use the product. So Lisa, as an environmental organization, why did Surfrider Europe pick up the cigarette filter issue? What convinced you to take this on as a central theme as an environmental group? I'm curious about what were the key elements that convinced you about that, and were you ever also approached by the tobacco industry on those matters?
Sure. So I will try to not repeat some things that have been said before, but this perfectly highlights the synergies we have here. But yeah, before to start, as you said previously, so Surfrider Foundation Europe, we are an European environmental NGO that was created in 1990 by surfers and let's say ocean lovers who saw and experienced the increase of marine pollution. And so since then, we built a very wide network of volunteers throughout Europe, and we organize many waste collections operations. It's much more than just beach cleanups. Because the waste we collect will be quantified according to diverse robust protocols and be transformed in valuable data that we use for advocacy. So from the local to the national in different European countries to the European and then international level. So how is it related to cigarette filters? So as we said, this is the most littered item worldwide. No matter where we organize this type of operations, this is the first item. This is the item we collect the most. So some key numbers, I think most of you have them in mind, but over 4.5 trillion of cigarette butts are discarded globally each year. And they, of course, contribute to microplastics pollution because they are made of plastic in most of the time, of cellulose acetate. They contribute also to chemical pollution with over 7,000 toxic chemicals into the environment, so which leak into soil and water, and of course have a significant impact on coastal and marine ecosystem. So we have very strong data that a single butt can contaminate up to 1,000 liters of water, and of course these have impacts. They are deadly for animals, so for birds, fish, marine mammals, that can often mistake them for food and leading to ingestion, poisoning, and sometimes death. So, of course, this is a huge problem, but still overlooked by decision makers. And that's why each year, for decades now, we mobilize thousands of volunteers across Europe to collect cigarette butts and to highlight this problem, this environmental problem. But this is not also about removing millions of cigarette butts from the streets. We really use this opportunity to call for a ban of cigarette filters, because this, I think, is really part of the DNA at Surfrider. Is when there is a problem, the best way to address it is to act at the roots of the problem. And as we do for many single-use plastic pollution, the best way is to ban such products. Of course, with the differences and the distinctions of tobacco products that to us cannot be dealt with as any other single-use plastics products. So why we decided to put the focus on it for our participation in the Plastics Treaty. So of course, we were following the Plastics Treaty for many different articles. We are working on microplastics overall, on the leakages in the environment. But I feel like it was very interesting to talk about the misperception about filters and how we thought this would also be a new opportunity to just re-explain, do this information work to decision makers, but also to the public. Since we are working on this topic also at the European level, we are closely following the Single-Use Plastic Directive that should be revised next year. Also, for another reason, that is, cigarette butts are the most littered item worldwide. And I think this is also a very comprehensive and tangible pollution. We can see that when we are talking about microplastics and some other forms of pollutions, it can appear as a little bit hard to get a vision for people. And we have also to keep in mind that states delegates are most of the time not plastics or health experts. They are mostly working for foreign affairs, and I think cigarette butts pollution can be easily pictured by them. And we had seen that at previous INC, different polls that had been made just illustrated the lack of information from the delegates on this specific pollution. And another reason is, I think, on cigarette filters, it also illustrates a trend we see through like the promotion of fake solutions, or in the climate community, what we talk about is dangerous distractions, is that without questioning our use of some plastic products, some governments and also, of course, businesses, corporations will try to promote fake solutions such as bioplastic, biodegradable plastic. And this was also a very big concern, because we mentioned, but the terminology was cigarette filters made with plastic, I think, somehow, something like that. And of course, we had this fear of hearing a lot about biodegradable filters and opening the door maybe to some alternatives that do not address the problem. For example, for bioplastic, they still contain conventional plastic. Manufacture is just as polluting. So only talking about with this environmental perspective, this of course was a big concern for us. And so we decided to mobilize all our network through the Chile platform. So I will put it in the chat. So now our action is closed, because it was on the platform for the duration of the treaty, the round of negotiations. But basically, we wrote a text to be sent to the many heads of delegations of the EU. So it's a very easy application where you can put the contacts of different people, and all our volunteers managed to send an email directly from their own inbox, recalling all the impacts of cigarette butts. It's, of course, nonsense, if we could say, and also why the Plastic Treaty was an opportunity to ban them. And we had many great feedbacks from some delegation from the EU who received hundreds of messages about it, and who tried to at least to take a bigger look at it. So of course, from the beginning, I think with these treaty negotiations, we thought that The discussions were very chaotic and difficult, especially for some countries of the EU, and this problem was not addressed in the first days, and we saw that there was this tactics from other countries to reopen discussions on previously agreed topics. But I think, yes, we tried at least to inform better decision makers about it. And we also took part in different mobilizations, so on the ground, but also in the last day in front of the Palais des Nations. And we had a French MP who is part of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Plastics Treaty, who joined us, and it was an opportunity also for us to talk with him about it and how could France support it in the next rounds of negotiation and at the EU level. So. Of course, this is not the only scales, as I said. We have had very small but recent victories, I think. In France, for example, no, I think it was, yeah, early 2025, the ban of disposable vapes, and we will continue following it. And we hope that we can keep this momentum to push for a ban of cigarette filters at the EU and try to have France as a strong ally on it. And of course, the elaboration of the revision of the single-use plastics directive, hoping that it could keep a momentum and pressure on the EU delegations, and hope that the EU could be more vocal on this topic for the next round of negotiations. So that's why we decided to have this campaign there. And of course, this is not only about the global plastics treaty on our side, on yours too, but how it can help to have different entries in different agreements, and how this could also complement the actions we have in different countries.
Thank you, Lisa. So it sounds like to some extent it was like somewhat an organic thing within your movement. It's not like the health community came to you. It sounds like this is something that on your own. So we're quite pleased about that this happened, and we're happy about the conclusion also that which is to ban all filters. And so then you bring up the single-use plastic directive, and so this is a question to all panelists. So at this stage we have a treaty that's not finished. So where should the issue of filters should be addressed next? Should it be at the next round of the COP, the FCTC, given that we know that topic will be on the agenda? Should it be the next plastic treaty, or should it be a combination of also other mechanisms that we should use? For example, like the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste, for example, and their disposal, or the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. Given that we could make the point that tobacco products or nicotine products produce toxic substances that qualify hazardous waste, and they could fit under those instruments, or regional agreements like the Single-Use Plastic Directive, for example, or the TPD, the Tobacco Product Directive. I'm curious about your views on that, and our colleague Carl Biffen, who was supposed to join us today, is sick, but Carl Bierenfenger, he did provide a response to that, and his view was that in the context of this, and his view was that, well, it's hard to tell, to be honest, how we're going to achieve a no-filter ban with current legislative opportunities centered on tackling only bioplastics, so like the Single-Use Product Directive or the Plastic Treaty. But we'll see how everything develops. So that was his short answer on that. But I'm curious to hear from all of you. What do you think are the next, from all the platforms that we have, what should be the priority now moving forward? Jeff, do you want to go first? And then
Yeah. So I think the best opportunity is the one that's nearest in the future, which is our COP. We have the competence, and I say that in the broad, in the technical sense, and also an extraordinary history behind this. Prior to COP 11, which is coming up, the issue of filters has been, in a sense, kind of filtered through vectors here and there, Articles 9, 10, a little bit, Article 18, environment, and talked about in a general sense. At this COP, there are 4 vectors in, all pointing to filter bans. We've got 910, the report,
Do
which
you want to tell
calls.
people quickly what 910 is? Because
Oh, sure. Sorry. It's regulation of tobacco products and also reporting requirements. So it's really nine tobacco product regulation. And the Article 910 report from WHO and also the report indicate, reaffirm the idea that appeal and attractiveness is, that's what the filters do. And with the partial guidelines, that's all we need because appeal attractiveness is in there. We don't have to go through and finish the guidelines and go from partial to total. So that is one report or two documents in this particular COP. And they call for basically a filter ban or movement toward that. Then we've got environment, Article 18. The expert group report is very clear on this. Basically, we should be banning filters. In liability, Article 19, there is a discussion about the criminal complaints from France, Netherlands, and Finland with respect to tobacco filters, light cigarettes, and so on. And in this, I should remind people that Robert Proctor, who is never shy about saying what he believes, called filters the deadliest fraud in the history of human civilization. So, that those three articles are all represented within this COP. In addition, Article 2.1 on forward-looking measures, one of the 16 forward-looking measures is a filter ban. So the supplementary document, 175 pages of the information briefs that were prepared across the 16 forward-looking measures, that isn't yet published, but it should be, pretty soon. But the abstract is up on the website. So all of these vectors going in at the same time, it should happen here. This is a best case scenario where there are multiple directions from product regulation, from environment, from liability, and then from forward-looking measures, all pointing toward the need for a filter ban. I'm hoping that we can get it done because I think this is our best opportunity, and I'm not sure what's going to happen after this, but this is the time to do it. In addition, of course, with the Global Plastics Treaty, there has been an increasing broader awareness from the environmental community of what we have always tried to be doing with respect to tobacco control. So that provides a sort of a atmospheric also support for our efforts at COP11. So those on the call and advocacy groups and stakeholders, this would be an extraordinary opportunity to get something done. It also, of course, will greatly reduce appeal. Light cigarettes are going to be, basically filters make the fraud of light cigarettes possible. It also allows a nice structure for introducing flavors and other additives that further increase appeal. If the filter is not there, it becomes increasingly very technically very difficult for the industry to continue to deceive consumers about reducing harshness and so on. So all of this indicates that if anything's going to happen at COP11, I think filter bans are a really powerful opportunity and would represent an historic moment in global tobacco control.
Thanks for that. Clearly, we have a number of, and I think this is very important for the environmental community and those of you who are joining us today not from the tobacco control field, but the environmental field. Indeed, there's a number of the synergy and the link between environmental issues and tobacco will be front and center at this COP. And it provides an amazing opportunity, given that, as you said, there's a number of outcomes from the last COP and those reports that make it very clear, call on governments or recommend that governments use upstream measures to the to address the tobacco filter issue.
Let me just very briefly add, Laurent, that at the Global Plastics Treaty, we know how challenging, perhaps impossible, it is to mention or to get enacted upstream measures. But in the FCTC, we've got Article 9. We can do it. So this is the place to do it at the COP.
Absolutely. That's a really great opportunity for us to do it. And I'm conscious of time. I know we have a number of questions on the chat box, on the Q&A section, and we had previous questions. So I'm going to kind of merge them a little bit to give everyone the time to address them a little bit. And I would like you to address, and I would like for all the other panelists to address a little bit of this how do we go forward with what we have? But addressing maybe Maxime from the Norwegian Cancer Society, who asked a little bit about whether the difficulty in the negotiations was because of the difficulties multilateralism at this moment that the world is experiencing versus corporate capture of the subversive power of industries. And I would like you to address that also in the context of as we move forward with those two parallel negotiations going on, the FCTC, the COP, and also some environmental negotiations. But how do we maximize on this process and bring the environmental community on board while educating them about Article 5.3 of the FCTC, which is the article that calls on that basically forbids for the tobacco industry to influence health policy. But at the same time, bring the environmental groups on board, which may not be aware about this. And in some cases, we know of environmental groups which, because of misguided reasons at times, may have had partnerships or cleaning campaigns with tobacco industry and so on and so forth. So there's a few questions in one here. But how do we move forward with those various negotiation processes, and how do we best bring the environmental community on board to work in synergy and to accelerate both environmental as well as health goals and objectives through those various processes? Paula, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start with you on that one, and then I'll have Lisa and Liz and Jeff, Liz and Lisa and Jeff respond to that also. Paula, would you mind going first? If my question made sense.
Yes, sure. No, it's a lot, but I was looking at the chat and I was also listening to all of you, and I echo everything that has been said before. And I was reflecting a little bit about this thing about like the crisis of multilateralism and how difficult it's to negotiate a treaty in the current global context, right? Which is very different from when we negotiated the FCTC more than 20 years ago. This is obviously a major issue that makes it more. And if we think about the pandemic treaty was an emergency, it took 13 rounds of negotiations. If we look at the recently still not adopted, but I mean the high-level meeting declaration on non-communicable, the political declaration for the high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases that took place at the UN last week. There was like, for the first time in history, it was not kind of approved in the high-level meeting. It was transmitted to the General Assembly. It will be adopted because there is a clear majority of member states supporting it. But I mean, it's also part of that crisis, right? Because of the US, it's walking out and followed by Argentina and so on. So the geopolitical crisis, I mean, this is obvious, plays a role. But at the same time, I think the increase in concentration of power in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations, it's also there. So for example, in the high-level meeting political declaration, the fingerprints of the industry, it's all over the place, right? So most of the important like recommendations, they have been watered down and have been like in the language of just consider adopting, like, and we are talking about measures that are really clearly recommended from recommendations from the WHO best buys, for example, like health taxes. It's one of the topics, right? When you talk about non-communicable diseases. So can you imagine, like at this day today, a high-level meeting political declaration just saying that you just consider tobacco taxation, tobacco and alcohol taxation? I think it's very like really, really low standards and really, really low. So in that sense, given the context, I really think that the tobacco control movement, I mean, our participation in that forum was extremely successful, because I think we managed to put the topic and agenda in a context in which banning cigarette butts, it's just like a very, very small part of a much larger structure of a treaty, right? For the plastic treaty. So there are discussions about financing mechanisms. There are discussions about whether you're only looking at like the downstream measures versus the upstream, as Jeff said, and it's incredibly difficult. We do not have the partners that we did, the allies that we had for the FCTC, as for example, we had really Southeast Asia, we had India, we had all the like Middle East countries. They're all on the other side now when we come to the plastic treaty. So that makes a difference, because how did we manage to overcome the member states who are completely dominated by corporate capture, like the US, for example, and others? It was because we had this Southern collaboration that was very strong and helped us a lot. And we don't have it right now. So that's a major issue. So just responding a little bit, dialoguing with the question that was posed there, I think it's a mix of both, right? They are completely interconnected because of these like power asymmetries, that they are not becoming lesser, they're becoming stronger. And not only governments are captured by corporations, but NGOs are captured by corporations. I mean, so many stakeholders are captured by corporations. So I think that's a major challenge that we have. But on the positive side, I think it should be discussed everywhere. I think everywhere there is opportunity to discuss, and I'm completely with Jeff. The next best opportunity, it is the COP11 for the FCTC. It is really the place to kind of discuss it from the health perspective, to start with the health perspective, right? Whereas in the plastic treaty, you start with the environmental perspective, and health, it's one of the issues. So obviously, I think, and that will be helpful for the plastic treaty if it's like gets like further in the COP, right? In the FCTC COP. And I think another challenge, which I think we could do something about collectively, is the lack of like health delegations participating in the plastic treaty negotiations. I think this is something that because we have such like a strong community in tobacco control, I think we should really motivate and like really ask people, help people to become engaged in the plastic treaty, because I think that will be extremely helpful to change kind of the recommendation. I mean, to change how the negotiations go in terms of like what priorities are we talking about. So I think it's definitely not over. And I'm echo also what Lisa's mentioned before about like all the fake solutions. I think this is another major challenge that we have not only in this forum, but many other forums. We are just proposing like new technological solutions that will be biocompostable. But on the upside of that, I think when we talk with our environmental organizations, they do understand what it is, what conflict of interest is. They really would love to have like ways of mitigating conflict of interest. So I think the conversations that we have there, they are very positive. People understand what we are talking about. So that's, for me, it's a huge opportunity for the tobacco control community, like really to make the tobacco control treaty kind of a role model for many other issues of like some fundamental topics that need to be on the table of discussions, which is like conflict of interest and the connection between health and environment, because everything is interconnected in the world today. So I see from an advocacy optimistic side, I think it's good to expand. And having said that, to expand, we also need to be solidary with the issues that are important for the environmental community, right? So we need to say, well, we are not at this stage, at this point, discussing the list of products to be banned, which cigarette filters is the obvious one. But there are so many other important topics. How can we help in these other important topics? Because I think it needs to be a two-way road in that sense, that we are supportive because, wow, we have a history that can help in those discussions. And I think we have been doing that in many ways. And I think this is good for us and for them. It will just like create a larger community in issues that cannot be separated today. We cannot really separate those issues. They walk together.
Could you very quickly because one of the challenges that has come up during those negotiations is environmental groups, for example, in the tobacco control movement, and having an Article 5.3, which makes it very clear that the tobacco industry needs to stay at arm's length. And in our treaty from the get-go, that was a very central theme, even before the first round of negotiations, even the regional work that was taken ahead of the negotiations that already was established pretty quickly as a sense and need to keep the tobacco industry away from the global regulatory process to address tobacco products. That is not quite the same setup we have with environmental treaty negotiations, where corporations are much more part of the process. UNEP is much more tolerant towards corporate actors than the WHO is, for example. The WHO has a very strong framework of engagement with non-state actors, which UNEP does not have, and so on and so forth. So that relationship between corporations and nonprofits, as you pointed out, a lot of them are somehow captured to some extent, or those relationships are considered more normal within those movements. How do we bring the environmental community on board without ostracizing them right away, given that some of them may have been more open to industries? Do you have any recommendations? I wonder with Lisa whether you'd have something to add to that. But how do we create stronger joint movements and bring these people on board versus just criticize them for what they may have done in the past and missing an opportunity to bring them on board as our potential allies?
I think it's important to understand the history of the organization, where they come from, right? And we cannot ask for organizations that never been in our universe of tobacco control that has really we have a much more clear understanding of what it means, right? So I think we need to have some level of tolerance in terms, which is tolerance in terms of like, well, if it's natural for the environmental movement that corporations come and help with like, whatever, extended product responsibility or cleanups, initiatives, and so on. We know this is pretty much greenwashing, right? But I think we cannot attack the environmental organizations for having done some of that. I think we need to have conversations, in-depth conversations of what does it mean at the end of the day, and what is the level, what is it exactly that we're talking about? We cannot like make claims without being 100% sure of what's behind the process, what happened there. And I think we need more rather than less allies in our issues. So if we have, and also my understanding of coalitions is that the reason, the good point, the best reason for having a coalition is that you have people or organizations that play different roles in that coalition, or else it's not a coalition. It's just an organization that thinks the same, right? We are allowed to think differently in certain issues. We can have like temporary alliances for a specific topic. It doesn't mean that we are getting married with the organizations in that coalition. So you might be an ally for a specific ask, for example, that in other settings you'll not be an ally with. And that's the power of coalitions, and that's how it's more effective to push policies forward, right? So I'll never deny support for a very specific measure that is very clear. Anyone that wants to be on board for that specific measure, in that case, we're talking about cigarette filters. I think people are welcome to support that, right? That's the goal. And if it's very clear that that's the goal and you support that, I would be fine with that.
That just remind me a little bit, for example, in a human rights background, where the Danish Institute for Human Rights, for example, an organization that took Philip Morris money, we used that opportunity actually to encourage them to totally change their position. We're going to attack them and denounce that position, but provide an opportunity for communication, and led to a very strong position actually on our side. And versus that becoming a confrontational issue became an actually positive outcome. I'm conscious of time, so we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to, I know there's a number of questions out there, and some that are interesting, including the question on, given that WHO only can make recommendations, but the treaties, a treaty becomes hard law, and when a country ratifies it, they have obligation to this. So that we want to make sure that in those contexts, then we have the stronger step language that doesn't just tell countries to consider things, but that they take action. Countries must do X, Y, Z to protect health and the environment. So I'm going to give you each of you 1 minute for you have for concluding remarks, and we'll start. We start with you, Lisa, Jeff, and Liz and Paula, and for concluding remarks, and then we'll end the webinar. Lisa, why don't you go first?
Yes, first, thank you for this invitation. I think it is great to have such moments and such a platform to also have the opportunity to, yeah, to create synergies, because something we say a lot to our delegations, to decision makers, is to break silos. But sometimes as environmental NGOs, we don't even break silos within our community and with other health organizations. And I think this is very paramount for the next years. This is something we try also to do with our narratives to also highlight the impacts, for example, plastics can have on the environment, but also on human health, and to strengthen our links with experts, with researchers, and of course, other organizations that work on it. Another thing I think which is important, for example, at the French level, we can see a small debate starting on EPR, following of course, the integration, the transposition of the Single-Use Plastic Directive, and opposition at Surfrider has always to recall that tobacco products cannot be dealt with as other products, and there is a whole debate to have about the EPR, for example, outcome in France. On this topic, and something we would love to do in the next years is to yeah, to have a bigger conversation with NGOs, with environmental NGOs that are part of the EPR, but also French organizations such as CNTC. We worked a lot with about the situation in France, and I really hope that we could have something launched very soon about it, and maybe a positive aspect on it. So, of course, we have all seen the shift and the changes in the geopolitical context and the impacts it had on the plastics treaty negotiations. But we had some victories on ocean-related agreements recently, whether it is the BBNG that has been adopted just this month after more than 60 ratification following a 20 years process. And we have now a small team, but really solid, of ocean champions. And I think as NGOs, we can try to get in touch with these countries to ask for a more coherent and coordinated approach. And this means also having a stronger position on all these health subjects. So thank you again for for inviting us to this conversation. And I really hope that we could continue working together for the Global Plastics Treaty, but for all the others agreements that are ongoing and the future ones.
Thank you for that. And thanks also for mentioning the problem with ALCOM, those eco-organisms. And that's one of the problems we've seen, and it's created a major conflict of interest in situations in which, in the context of a circular economy, laws and provisions that unfortunately some ministries of health, of environment, of ecological transitions have unfortunately created partnership with organisms that have, or institutions that are tied to the tobacco industry. And one of the things I think in some previous calls that I've had with you, one of the things that you're pushing, and something that we are also pushing for, is moving away from, especially for tobacco, moving away from extended producer responsibility to extended producer liability, and to hold them liable and responsible for the harm they cause to our health and our environment. So thank you for that, Lisa. Um, um, uh, who was next? Was it you, Jeff? I can't remember.
Yeah, let me just say this, that the FCTC has advanced primarily through implementation of the demand reduction policies, such as warning labels, uh, I guess smoke-free taps bans, and so on. But at the very heart of the problem of tobacco is the product. Article 9 has the greatest promise and upstream to do so much to significantly reduce demand. At the COP11, we have the opportunity to implement what may be the most impactful FCTC policy of all, uh, a tobacco product regulation that is known to be extraordinarily deceptive and lead people to continue to smoke and to start and to continue with this. Filter bans are extraordinarily important for their health impact in reducing misperceptions, as well as having extraordinary reduction in environmental harms. So all focus should be on this policy, and we hope that we can get a strong decision and move forward in this.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And you point out those upstream measures, the supply reduction measures, which had been somehow neglected in the treaty process. There were some supply measures in the FCTC, but that really is part of that process, and we've seen a great movement in that area. Liz, you're next, and then
Sure, thank you. So I really see that the status where we are at this point with the plastics treaty is creating a real urgent opportunity for us at the COP. So taken together, our work across the COP and the plastics treaty really is an opportunity to connect health, environment, human rights, so that all these global instruments don't just sit side by side. And then hopefully at one point they can reinforce each other in holding the tobacco industry accountable, but also creating a precedent to hold other industries accountable as well, protecting everyone. In terms of the COP, just as Jeff and others were saying, Article 18 will be a big focal point, but also Article 2.1, or what some are referring to, can be called the endgame article, will be a tremendous opportunity in an area that I hope that we can all focus on in November at the COP. And I will stop there because I know we're out of time.
Paula.
I'll be very quick. I think together we are stronger, and we more than ever we need to walk hand in hand, like health, environmental, and human rights. We need to talk and be strategic, and still, like the FCTC, it's like our golden standard. We need to use it wisely, and we need to focus on effective regulation and policies for all areas, and like help each other.
Thank you, Paula. So I think we have an amazing opportunity for synergy. So let's take advantage of the upcoming COP11 negotiations. Let's keep an eye on what's happening also with the updates around the plastic treaty negotiations. But it sounds like we have really amazing opportunities for synergy in a somehow complex geopolitical context right now. So that synergy could really help advance things. I want to also remind everyone that we have a webinar on the 22nd of October in collaboration with the Pan American Health Organization and Corporate Accountability on the strategy and plan of action to strengthen tobacco control in the region of the Americas. That's on the 22nd. And we have a whole set of other webinars also that just check online. And also in the context, and it ties to the work we do, one of the, and as you heard today, Jeff mentioned, one of the items on the agenda of the upcoming COP is forward-looking measures that align with Article 2.1 of the treaty, which is the article that calls on countries to go beyond the measures of the treaty to better protect the health of their citizens. So we have this course online that you're welcome to join, sign on for, and we encourage everyone to do that, given that's also part of the movement forward, and it does include filter bans as part of one of the measures that could be addressed in that context. So again, thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Apologies that we're 4 minutes over time. We try to normally finish right on the dot of the hour. So apologies for those 4 extra minutes. But thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the panelists for giving us your time today. And that was quite interesting. And I hope that it was quite helpful also for the attendees. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to working with you on all those various treaties and to help improve both health and the environmental health.